Hi, everybody. It's 9:33 right now, and the very first part of Responsible AI is to let you know what time we'll end this panel session. So you can plan. We'll end sharply at 10:15, and then you can proceed on to your panel break. Now, Hadi, who happens to be one of the overall organizers of the conference, I think the actual names and backgrounds of the panelists would already be known to the people in the audience. That's probably why you're sitting here in the first place, okay? So here's how we're gonna start. We're gonna do just a quick lightning round of introduction where we're not gonna go into the fancy titles and the wonderful accomplishments, because that's why you're here, right? So a more simple, grounded statement of what you actually do every day. Like, what is your milieu? What is your context? What do you encounter that gives you some insight into this issue of responsible AI, all right? Then we're gonna have a second round on how does your organization operationalize and scale corporate efforts for responsible AI? You'll have to say something what you mean by responsible AI, and we're not gonna pontificate on why it's important. We're gonna take that as a given. We're not gonna think about all the multitudinous dimensions. You're gonna selectively say something about how you operationalize and scale, all right? All right, and then the third is some of the new initiatives you're doing. Stephen just gave a whole talk on that. So why don't we start by here, perhaps just start with your name, and what do you do every day that gives you some insight into this topic?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah, my name is Hao Hong. I'm a consultant in EY, and I'm leading the data and AI services we provide to the client. Yeah, being it strategy development.
What do you really do?
Yeah, so in short, we do two type of projects. Yeah, we do AI strategy type of project for our client, basically with the aim to help them to better their AI system roadmap, and also from organization infrastructure perspective. The second part of things, we do all sorts of AI solution implementation type of works for cross-industry, for finance, for supply chain, and also for power and utility, etc. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Andrew Tompkins from Google, and I'm in the research organization. So I work with a bunch of my colleagues. I'm maybe not 100% dedicated to work on responsible AI, but the teams that I kind of partner with, we work a lot on different aspects of AI, and many of them touch responsibility. So I work a lot on privacy, and privacy is part of responsible AI that has the interesting property that people are very demanding about the utility side as well as the privacy side. So you kind of have both, you have the creative tension there, maybe. And I also work with some colleagues on classification of images and text and multimodal settings that have some applications in the area of kind of trust and safety, toxicity detection, sensitive content, classifying issues that might come up in sort of like dialogue style natural language, as well as in images both in search or in advertising or in other parts of the company. We work a little bit on robust AI and stability as well, and then a bunch of questions just kind of in the algorithm space, ML efficiency and research questions around kind of maps and routing and the geo part of the company.
All right, I'm Steve, and since I quote unquote retired from Singapore Management University, although I haven't retired, I've looked at maybe 60 plus AI deployments from the perspective of the frontline users making use of the systems. And I've worked with some teams doing digital transformation projects and teams working on the creation of AI projects. So rather than sort of talk to the C-suite executives, more on the working level of teams working on the deployments of these things or people actually making use of the systems.
Thank you, Steve. And Steve Miller is the founding team of this SMU School of Computing Information System. He's super expert in this AI area and running many projects. And I have a very privilege to work together with Steve over the past year. And very exciting to have him in this panel channel. In fact, he's super expert. And he also written a very good books in this area of working AI with human. And I think we also want to hear your advice and maybe your comment also sharing on this topic. Just a little more introduction about myself. I actually, in addition to running this AI research team for fundamental AI research that mostly done with Salesforce Research Asia and Salesforce Research in US, we also have a lot of projects. In fact, I would say an important responsibility of our research team is how can we deliver this AI capability to our customer? And that is largely done with our applied AI project. And I'm also the corporate vice president for the company for leading many of these great initiatives. And we actually collaborate across many organizations at Salesforce with both our product and engineering team across Singapore, India, UK, US, around the world. And very important is that we need to ensure AI is delivered efficiently, safely, ethically to our end customer. And when we build the AI, it can range from multiple stages. It could be this existing system we want to put new AI capability to enable, or it can be completely new initiative and new prototype that built from AI research organization, and we put them into a new product, get to deploy in our real system. And our AI research team is involving in many types of applied projects within Salesforce organization. And many of projects, unfortunately, they are not able to be published because a lot of them involving customer data. So you see a lot of research paper we publish is fundamental AI research. We are very much more open than any other organization in terms of our open source code, open source model. Whenever we are committing to publish a paper, but when we're dealing with customer data, we are very carefully to protect our customer safety, privacy, and we do carefully to deliver the result to our product responsibly. I hope that clarifies some of my roles.
All right, now we're going to get into issues where I've previously spoken with the panel. And of course, if you're working with Google, working with E&Y, how do you operationalize and scale some things related to responsible AI? You could spend a month and we still couldn't cover all of the topics. So obviously, they're going to have to be very selective and make some specific statements about a selectively few set of examples, as opposed to sort of averaging general comments across the giant portfolio of examples. I thought these more specific, in a way, inductive, bottom-up types of examples would be more helpful to the audience and would trigger your ideas about more general principles. So let's start with you, Andrew, and here's the question. A few selected examples of things that you want to speak about within your company, how they operationalize and scale efforts for responsible AI.
Okay, I'm going to maybe just give you a little sense of Google's framework. So Google's approach to this problem, and then I'll try to get into one or two examples to kind of make it concrete. So Google's been, I would say, hit by a wave of transformation that came from AI stuff for many years now. In the early days of sort of large language modeling with BERT and with T5, starting in the research organization maybe and rolling through the whole company, every product, almost 100%, have been hit by kind of like very significant transformations.
Well,
so
not to mention that Google gave us transformers.
Okay, right,
So Google,
thank you.
Google created the foundations upon which this is all based, basically.
Yeah, so Google's had some time to try and tackle these questions on responsible AI. And I think maybe like the first thing I want to say about that is that it's very easy to think that there's some questions about like bias and recidivism predictions or skin tone sliced classification errors on image analysis, and that by establishing a couple of metrics in these areas, we might be able to say that's our approach to responsible AI. And it's so much broader than that. Those are really important questions, but it's not really possible to kind of tease it down to a handful of numbers. In the end, it has to be more of this umbrella kind of portfolio play. So I think Stephen gave a bunch of examples this morning, so maybe I won't kind of like belabor too much, but when you think about moving all the way from kind of the questions of sustainability, the questions of like, will these new technologies help or hurt the inequality that we're seeing increasingly in the world, and then these more core questions about sort of like core technical details of how the algorithms work. Each of these areas, and there are dozens of them, kind of require a lot of careful thinking one by one as we move our way through them. So I guess I'd sort of like frame it that way to say it's very broad. So how does Google in particular tackle this? Back in around 2017 or so, there was an idea that we would kind of establish what would feel like the Constitution. Would be like a set of principles. They'd be very concise and easy to state and understand. And then there would be a body of case law, if you will, that would kind of come underneath them and would represent like decisions that had been made as capabilities or products were taken through this process. And they would be patterns that could be then applied a little bit more broadly. So there's 7 of the principles. They're very easy to state and go through, and there's a little bit underneath them that you can find kind of doing research. AI should be socially beneficial. It should avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias. It should be built and tested to safety. It should be accountable to people. It should incorporate privacy design principles from the get-go. Should uphold high standards of scientific excellence, and it should be made available for uses that are in accordance with the principles. So those are kind of like 7 principles, and then there's a process for a new piece of technology or a new product that maybe raises questions along these lines for how to run it through the principles. So the process is kind of 4 stages. It's an intake thing to find the things that are kind of important enough that we really want to take it through. There's an analytical phase of trying to understand like what are the issues with the technology. That often involves the product team itself, many other parts of the company, sometimes outside experts in different areas are kind of brought in to sort of weigh in and think about it. Then there's a discussion with the product team about like, here are the issues that seem to be coming up. Here are possible remediations. Let's go back and forth and try to come to something that is valuable to the product and accords with the principles. And then finally, there's a decision. That's the thing that establishes the precedent. And hopefully that means that it's possible to take these through again. So maybe I'll just sort of, to keep things kind of tight on time, I'll go through one example of this, which was actually the very first example that went through this process. So in 2016, the cloud organization had a vision API that was in beta. It had a whole bunch of kind of computer vision capabilities in it. And as the beta was coming to a close, there was a lot of requests from customers for facial recognition to be added to the API. And the organization was not comfortable at that point. And in 2017, there was internal work in the company on sort of establishing principles of fairness, and it raised facial recognition as an area that had a lot of concerns in that area. So this facial recognition question was used as sort of the first example of bringing something through this process. It actually spawned a whole bunch of different internal and external processes that were to do with the technology and kind of slicing data in different ways, but also to do with like, what's the societal context, what's the human rights sort of implications of facial recognition and the way that it tends to be deployed and the way that data tends to be gathered. In the end, there was a decision not to launch that, and many of our other kind of frenemies in the tech space have kind of followed on with that decision. It kind of gave us space to step back a little bit and say, is there some way that this technology could be used in a way that sort of aligns with the principles but still brings value? And after that was sort of worked through with the product team, the cloud org did actually release an API, which was a facial recognition, like a celebrity facial recognition API. And so that involved a whole bunch of analysis on the data, a whole bunch of kind of work with experts in the human implications of the decision. And in the end, it made it through as a positive decision that was not the original idea, but it was something that, after working through the process, actually made a lot more sense to kind of stay in alignment with the principles. So that's the type of flow that we like to kind of promote. And maybe with that, I will pass on.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'll share a little bit about the EY. How do we ensure our AI delivery is responsible? So I'm not talking about EY is not an AI firm. So we do develop AI technologies at a global setting. So, but at a local setting, mostly what we do is really to deliver AI implementation and strategy services to our clients. So just in this consulting setting, what we do have a trusted AI framework. Yeah. So we know the AI in the market, AI implementation in the market has a lot of failures. If you do a quick check with Google, I think easily they could tell you about 50 to 80% of the AI solutioning work, eventually they fail. Yeah. But in the past, I have personally involved I just counted yesterday, about 22 delivery in the past 5 years. Then they're all successful. I think part of is really the way we have been doing that. So we have a trusted AI framework. They emphasize about 5 aspects. So the first thing, we start with performance. So we're saying that's most of the time is the first reason people wanted to do an AI project. They want to, something has been built, is usable by the stakeholders, and is high performing. It's better than what they're having now. So we have to make sure we understand what is the baseline and how to articulate the AI value. And we also need to make sure by design we're solving the right problem. Eventually what we have delivered, they can connect to the business setting, the user can use it. So the second pillar is really on the unbiased, but I would not want to emphasize too much. I think exactly there's one audience is asking the question is to what extent, and sometimes people is asking for the models, if you want this more, or the unbiased to us is we're trying to provide a due diligence to make sure it's fair enough. It doesn't go against any of the regulations, and it is not unethical in terms of performance. Yeah, but sometimes it could be a trade-off. If you're going for unbiased too much, you're losing out from the performance side. And thirdly, and the first is really on the transparency and the explainability. Transparency basically means the user should have sufficient knowledge about how the AI is going to work. It's always needed for my client because they want to know what exactly are the inputs that goes into the AI system. And eventually they help to produce an outcome. Yeah, they need to have that level of understanding to be able to trust how the model is going to work. Because from time to time, they could make the same decision using 1 or 2 attributes in a very manual way. Yeah. Then, but they still can estimate, but they trust that result is not too far off. So with the knowledge about how AI system work at a high level, they don't have to know everything, but they need to know enough to be able to trust the outcome. Explainability is really for the outcome that has been generated. Then they could have different levels. It's as Steve has mentioned, is still growing. So they could be done at a model level, or it also can be done at a per prediction level. So this depends on the needs, can be implemented for the client as well. Then lastly, it has to be resilient. Largely we're talking about the security. So the security has 2 parts. One is on data and IT system. So the system has to be resilient against attacks. The other part of that is really on the AI logics, because there can be all sorts of attacks directly on the AI logics. Yeah, for example, the models could be extracted, and people can utilize your feedback loop to provide the poisoning samples, so that eventually your model's performance will be skewed to a way which is unexpected. Yeah. then there will be advisory attacks and all this. So basically, in the last year, I was also part of the AITC for reviewing international standards. So locally, Singapore has published a standard, just to discussing about how to make an AI model more resilient so that eventually against different attacks. Maybe I just quickly to share 1 or 2 examples on what we have been doing. So we use trusted AI framework to do our own delivery much better. So it's really a comprehensive checklist. They'll be able to position at the different stages of AI development from the problem identification to the data identification and to the development stage and also to the deployment stage. They provide guidance for AI developers to look into a set of specific issues to make sure they're on the right track. Maybe not all are relevant in a specific setting, but at least the AI developers, they are aware what they need to pay attention to. So that's from checklist perspective. Secondly, when we come to do AI strategy work, for example, for healthcare ministry locally, what we do is we really use that as a blueprint to help the ministry to establish AI governance framework. So basically, it will be a user-friendly setting to help them to being able to classify the risk of AI project when come to implementation, and also to manage that through the implementation and the deployment. So an important part of the AI framework is also to have a tool, what we call model ops. Is in other people, they're also talking ML ops. So that's an important assets that need to be developed. So EY has been looking into this to build a model ops reference framework. Reference framework means something, it can be realizable with real technologies. And we have realized that with open source technologies. But we can use that to counter-check and to review organizations' AI system and to suggest improvements, what they need to do to better their model ops. So with that, the AI development and deployment can be more efficient. Okay, I'll end here.
I'm going to pass this to Stephen Hoy, who just gave us a whole talk, so we sort of know what Stephen Hoy just showed us. But since you're inside Salesforce, and since your research is motivated by their current state and their needs, I still would like you to give your observations on what you see within Salesforce, not necessarily in the research group, but in the company at large, on what you think are important aspects of how they're trying to operationalize and scale and, related to that, defined responsible AI. We already know the principles, but what are they doing to make that happen given the scale at which they operate?
Yeah, sure. Very, very good question. And I want to leave more time for other panel speakers to share more. Just give a lot of talk. But absolutely. Just a little more about the operation structure in terms of how we do this responsible AI. We have an office of this ethical use, and we have a dedicated team to just focus on ethical AI review. And this team is not only just dedicated for doing AI research, they are also in charge of all the product and development at Salesforce. And in fact, we have engaged in 2 types of projects. One is more focused on fundamental research, primarily within our AI research team. And this including, we need to make sure that not just define the principle, but we also provide a guidance how to educate our research to practice them in a day-to-day research. Whenever they engage in high-risk project, we need to make sure that the ethical advisory team is engaged in the early stage of a project. And when they roll out and release the model, we need to make sure that their research is fully gone through this ethical review process. And this is mostly on the research team that we have a systematic way to managing our research conduct at Salesforce. Now, the other way is more on this applied project that we use AI to empower our other product. And the ethical review team also define a set of principles and practice to educate our engineer and product team how to practice them in any of this project. And it's very important that we are not just providing a guideline, but we also get our leadership to get engaged in early stages of this project, especially that in the culture-generated AI is getting more and more popular. We want to ensure that the leadership also have the mindset to ensure that the team is able to deliver and engage the ethical review in early stage of product design. And this is, I think we have a whole holistic way to address all these issues in many steps of our product development.
Let me just comment on that, because the ethical AI practices team at Salesforce was one of the case studies that I wrote up in this book I did with Tom Davenport on working with AI that MIT Press put out in September of 2022. So here's the interesting thing. Salesforce is not a small company. They're like 20 billion a year in revenue, something like that. I mean, not the size of Google, but they're not a small entity. The team that's the ethical AI team is actually very small. Actually, there's no hope. They cannot review every project in the company. So their approach to amplification is true. If they just proselytized and said, oh, well, responsible AI is important, that would be all nice and well and everybody would hear it at a training class, but nothing would happen. So it turns out, if I'm not wrong, model cards came out of Google. Okay, so for example, model cards came out of various groups at Google, and because of people in this space, you know, they're on workshops together and whatnot, the people in Salesforce saw that, this ethical AI team, they looked at it and they said, this is an approach that we could use across the company and that potentially could be scalable, right? So they didn't invent the concept of model cards. Thankfully, some people at Google demonstrated it. But then they said, how are we going to use it in Salesforce? And then they sort of kept advocating, and some product engineers increasingly started to build it into the ability of customer-used models so that simplified versions of model cards could be auto-generated. So this notion of you don't have to invent, you can borrow frameworks from the consulting firms or something, and then how do you have a small number of people in your organization so that I could put this stuff into practice, use it, amplify it? And what the Salesforce ethical AI team told me is that one of the biggest challenges is even if you have this stuff, it's getting people to contextualize it. Like somebody who's not doing facial recognition, right, will say, well, why do I have to worry about this? I'm not doing facial recognition. And they don't realize a lot of the everyday aspects that they're doing actually could have implications for different dimensions of responsible AI. So helping people with contextualizing this to their everyday work.
Yeah,
all right.
And you're absolutely right. I think to me, I think it's very important, not just the principle and tooling all this provide to end user. The most important is the mindset and culture. You need everyone to really responsible and follow that concept. And I think that's really important because you just cannot do ethical review in detail by every single team with the ethical review team. The important is that you need to get everyone, they take responsibility whenever they start any project that can be sensitive to all this issue. And I think that's very important.
Yeah. Before we do our last round where we maybe look at something new, let me just make a comment on this. How many of you have seen the book or even read the book called Noise? You've never heard of the book Noise?
I'm in the middle to finish.
All right. It's phenomenal. Danny Kahneman, you know, the guy who did Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, the Kahneman of Kahneman and Tversky, who did the pioneering work in behavioral decision making. For all of you, if you're involved in creating systems where you'll actually have real world users, It would be socially irresponsible to not read noise, right? And if you read noise, you realize that in many cases, not using algorithmic decision-making leads to issues of social responsibility, because bias is not the only concern that you need to worry about. There are the aspects of noise, which I won't explain. So what this says is in certain kinds of decision-making, not all, because they're looking at certain types of repetitive patterns of decisions, you need to use algorithmic decision-making, or else you have undesirable consequences, which in case means you really need to be in this issue of how are we going to do this in a responsible way. The point is, bias is not the only game in town. Noise is as big a source of error and variation, and actually socially undesirable outcomes as bias. So be aware of that. And I guess my second aspect of responsible AI is when people hear this term, they immediately jump to the social discrimination thing, which is not unimportant, but it's not the only aspect of responsible AI, right? And it's not even like 80% of what the important issues are in responsible AI, although it's one very important issue. Just being able to have a company culture where you can put up business cases where, of course, you're going to tell all the wonderful reasons why you want to do the new model and the new capabilities and why we want to have the project funded. All right, that's sort of standard business as usual. But where you put as much attention on characterizing the limitations of the model and its use, and doing that in a way where that's a culture where that won't kill the business case, but you take that stuff seriously. To me, let me just give a hint, that's an important aspect of responsible AI. All right, now let's go around our last round on maybe one or two very select things going on in your company that you consider a new direction or an important emerging direction of ways in which you're going to make responsible AI real, going beyond the concepts.
Thank you, Steve. So I think as many of you may know, EY is also a big auditing firm, one of the big four. So we have multiple service lines. So assurance auditing is a biggest one. So I want to talk a little bit about AI assurance. So largely it's AI auditing. You can think about we're asking the AI to be more responsible, but how do we enforce it? So I do see personally, this is would be a great service area that EY can provide to the rest of the world. Yeah. So what we have already been doing is really to look at for example, for the big banking and the financial institutions, to help them to review their AI system. They already have AI has been running in the past, but we help them to look at some of the representative ways they're doing in the AI, from process perspective, from coding perspective, from data input perspective. From that, we are offering the audit service to basically to tell them if that's trustworthy enough. And also from process technology perspective, we help them to recommend the data service operations, ML ops, and eventually with this to help them to become better, to implement the AI in a more responsible way. Yeah, so that's the one key direction we think that's promising. A pass to.
Thanks. Yeah, I really like that one. I think there's going to be a lot of need to audit the behavior of systems, some of it legally mandated, some of it maybe more ethically mandated. And it's super hard, like technically, just how to do that. Like, do you need to keep all the data around, which is the data that you really don't want to have around because it could be very sensitive? Like, or are there ways to do it through kind of tricks or fingerprinting or distributed computation or homomorphic encryption or whatever? And it's just a big, exciting area. So I was going to do sort of a short term and a long term. The long term is something that I kind of feel like it's going to define a lot of what is going on in responsible AI for the next like many years to come. But it's not something that is sort of like active in my life right now. Let me do it by way of an example. So think about the care of the elderly. So using the US as an example, there's maybe like 25% of people who are sort of 65 and up are measurably socially isolated. And if you look at loneliness, it's much higher. And so this is very prevalent, and the implications for health outcomes are dramatic. Like there's been very nice meta studies of the changes in mortality here, and social isolation and loneliness is well above what you would consider to be the very worst things, like heavy smoking or alcohol use. Okay, so that's a clear problem with a lot of opportunity and a lot of sort of like prevalence. And we have these incredible tools now coming into being that are like interactive, generative, and they can be creative, and they can sort of scaffold various kinds of interactions that people could have, like in an elder care setting. And so it seems pretty clear that a lot of that is going to happen. And we don't really have a framework in place to sort of evaluate like what are the harms there, like what kinds of interactions are harmful or beneficial in what ways, and what implications do they have for mortality, but also for sort of like more subtle and nuanced notions of how we're helping people's lives. So I kind of expect that in this sort of like look out over a few years, every vertical industry, maybe not everyone, but almost all of them, are going to see this kind of massive transformation as a result of these new tools kind of landing, certainly anything that involves interaction. And each of those probably, maybe we'll find some patterns over time, but probably we're going to have to look at them one by one and really go deep into what are the new questions we should be asking. We don't really have like well-developed tools to do that right now. So I think we're looking at horizontal questions of responsible AI, and that's great, it's really important, but we're going to have to get good at understanding how the tools interact with like a particular industry. Okay, so that's sort of what I imagine is going to come a lot more and more in the slightly longer term. Let me just do one that's shorter term, just to kind of clarify it. I talked a little bit about privacy at the beginning. So our model of the web, maybe just like loosely, is that the web has sort of been this transformative thing because it was a new way from a business standpoint for people to find a way to bring value by creating content and services and get paid for it. And so this whole ecosystem grew up around techniques to make that money flow. And the way it landed created the biggest burgeoning of sort of dissemination of human creative output that the world has ever seen, which is good. It also created like output that was sort of malicious and many issues along those lines. But even if we set aside those issues, it also created very dramatic opportunities for tracking and profiling of individuals. And so Google now has this Privacy Sandbox initiative, which is a multi-year, very significant investment in, is it possible to revisit the mechanisms that support the creative process, meaning like allow people to create content and services and monetize it, but without the tracking and profiling. And what I like about this as a sort of one of the slices of responsible AI is that maybe first the thing that I said before, like it's there's a very clear notion of utility, like you don't want to sort of break the web and all of the people out there who are relying on it for their livelihoods. And second, you have like pretty crisp notions of what's bad about tracking that you would like to go after. And so you want something that supports both of those use cases. This Privacy Sandbox initiative, you can read about it at privacysandbox.com. It has a ton of technical questions that span the whole gamut from kind of going after differential privacy and private mechanisms to distributed computation and proofs of security and multi-party types of computation with proofs of what's being leaked, along with like systems implications, hardware implications. And so I think it's a great example of many different disciplines coming together to attack one of these really big, hairy kind of problems in responsible AI, sort of like broadly construed. And so I would encourage people to just sort of check out what's going on there.
As we wrap up, let me just make one comment in the spirit of responsible AI. We know from the history of automation over decades and centuries, as well as over the last 40 years, of course there'll be job displacement. There always has been from automation, together with other factors going on in the economy. Of course, it's not just automation. But when you look at the last 40 years, when you look at the last 80 years, just a reminder, in the last 80 years, the level of people employed in the United States has increased over threefold. More computerization, more technology, more semiconductors, more digital than ever, yet over a threefold increase in employment. A team led by an MIT economist, although including people from other institutions, looked at the composition of work in 1940 and the composition of work in 2020, actually 2018. And they actually went back to the Bureau of Census detailed specification of job titles. And what they showed is when you look at the employment in 2020, which is over 3x the employment in 1940, over 60% of the jobs were jobs where the detailed job listing did not exist in 1940. Might be a similar family, but a detailed variant. Like you have an electrician going back to 1940, but an electrician who installs solar panels is a new type of thing, right? Okay, so the responsibility to create new types of work. When we think of AI applications, don't just think about how do we automate what we are already familiar with and already do. By definition, you can only automate what you're familiar with. You cannot automate what you're not familiar with. That's a long story in itself. So what you automate is the work of today and the work of yesterday. The path forward is to create new types of work, because that's where we'll get the offsets. Interestingly enough, responsible AI is very labor intensive. It's a great opportunity for creating new types of jobs. Stephen, you told us a lot about your work. If you could just conclude with a final statement on one or two things you would like to see happen over the next few years in the responsible AI space related to your research work.
Absolutely. I would say that if you look at the recent trend, the biggest transformation is the generative AI technology. And this is going to be the biggest impact in the next decade. And to me, we have a huge responsibility because this technology is going to impact many industries. And how can we ensure that we as a community and society, we are able to take responsibility to deliver this technology to the world. And I think there are two corners of the side. One is that we know the technology has huge opportunity. We want to move fast. We want the innovation. We want the team to be out here. We want fast go to market. On the other side, we know we need to do it correctly. We know we want to deliver the result, the technology in a safe way, in a responsible way. And there's a need to trade-off and in between the two corners of the side. And that's the way that we are trying to put up the guiding principle to our internal team and external team. I'm sure many companies are also doing the same. And I think it's not only enough just for one single organization to do this alone. We need more communication society effort. We need government to give them more guidance to provide the instruction, the laws support. We need academic community to more deeply study in this pressing issue. we need to industry to work together to share the experience and to share the tooling and practice so that we as a community, we are able to address this issue as early as possible before the technology is getting out to the market. And I think this is the most important topic to me in the next few years in terms of responsible AI.
We're done, and thank you, everybody.